Welcome to Aquarian Diary, where we discuss issues around the emerging age of Aquarius. I'm your host, John Irving. Thank you for joining me. Greetings all. It is October 30th, 2022. This Spirituality Essentials series is intended for a general audience, so please bear with me if you find some of this redundant. Another topic I think that is important to discuss is how various states of consciousness affect us socially. Very briefly, there are different states or levels of consciousness. The lower the level of consciousness, the smaller it is, the less it is able to perceive and therefore experience. And as you go into higher levels of consciousness, you start to perceive a lot more detail and nuance. A useful metaphor might be the difference between a really cheap sound system and a really high fidelity one, like an audiophile level sound system. On the cheap system, everything is kind of mashed together and there's not a lot of variation or range, and a lot of detail is missing. And on a really high-end, high-fidelity stereo system, you can hear all kinds of details and separation of instruments and much more clarity. In fact, if you've ever had that experience in real life, it can be astonishing because you will hear things in music that you've heard 1,000 times before that you never heard or never noticed, simply because the tool or the stereo that you were using to reproduce the recording was incapable of reproducing the detail and the clarity and the fidelity and the nuance of the original recording and what the sound engineers intended for you to hear. Also, interestingly, a really high-end audio system will make any flaws or a poorly mastered recording very evident. So you can hear all the good stuff, but you can also really hear any bad stuff in a recording as well. It helps if you have good ears. And again, that's another metaphor that is apt, because somebody with a higher level of consciousness just has the capability to perceive all these details and aspects of reality that someone on a lower level of consciousness wouldn't. Someone on a lower level of consciousness tends to be interested in much more primal kind of concerns: food, sex, their own personal pleasure and their own ego gratification. And again, as you go up higher into higher levels of consciousness, your consciousness expands and you are able to perceive much farther and deeper. So you're taking things like other people's experiences into consideration, perhaps even the welfare of the planet or the whole solar system or even the universe. Your consciousness continues to expand infinitely. Now, one of the things that is pretty common for people who are interested in spirituality, and there's a great term for that, which is a seeker. A seeker is somebody who is looking for higher truth and to make sense of reality, because purely rational or reductionist intellectual processes are incapable of explaining all of these much more subtle phenomenon. And so a seeker in their younger years may have some awareness of all of these much more ethereal aspects of reality, these more spiritual dimensions, but they may lack the framework or the vocabulary to even be able to describe what they perceive and experience. And it's very common that they don't even have anyone in their social circle that they are able to discuss such things with. Often, especially if someone grows up in a conservative environment, often when they are very young, they attempt to express some of these observations and then are shut down very quickly by their parents or relatives and siblings and so forth, because they literally do not want to hear what they're saying. And so the child will just quickly realize that they shouldn't even discuss these kinds of things. It might be something like psychic phenomenon that they experience or whatever, which are taboo, especially to people who, for example, are religiously fundamentalist. When I say they shut down, I mean they literally block it out. They try and pretend that it's not happening, or that they're not experiencing it, or at the very least, they simply don't discuss it. However, if you are a true seeker or somebody who is interested in and recognizes the reality of spirituality and spiritual experiences and the more subtle dimensions of the universe, it's very likely that you will eventually encounter other people who you can share these kinds of experiences with. And nowadays, especially with the internet, there's tons of stuff out there, like what I'm doing right now, for example. And there's books and materials and groups and organizations, and people more openly talk about these things, certainly than they used to. If you go back before the 1960s, in the West, it was almost zero, like very few, like a handful, relatively speaking, of people discussed these kinds of matters. In the East, with Buddhism and spirituality as it was practiced in places like India, it's a different matter. They have openly embraced these kinds of topics for centuries, if not millennia. However, even in those cases, if you were a real seeker, you had to kind of join an exclusive group or commit yourself to some kind of a path. And you generally, in some capacity, separated yourself from mainstream society so that you could focus on your spiritual work. So what happened was a lot of this information started to come from places like India and Asia in the 1960s as young people began to go out and explore different states of consciousness. And anyway, you can find a lot of material online now that is geared towards a Western audience. So back to the point I was trying to make, eventually you will come across somebody that you can actually have a discussion with about these kinds of topics, who will not shut you down and who will not think you are crazy or that you're a sinner or whatever. And this can be an extremely liberating event or time, because suddenly you can begin to open up to aspects of yourself that were always there, but that you may have been repressing for many years in some cases. And this will open up many doors to you to begin to explore your spirituality and your perceptions and experience. Wonderful. And initially, what tends to happen in my experience and observing what happens with other people is that at the early stages of encountering other people that you can have these kinds of discussions with, you are very open-minded because you're just thrilled to be able to do this for a change. And we tend to be very open to all these kinds of new encounters and this flood of new information and discussion and discourse and things like that. But because this is also new and exciting at this point, we may not practice as much discrimination as maybe we should when we look back at this point in time in the future. That's fine. It doesn't really matter, right? It's just something I've observed. Now, even then, you will likely find that there are different levels of consciousness within your social circle and within the organizations and individuals that you encounter. It can be quite magical in how it expresses itself and manifests. I myself have been in countless situations where there has been either discussion that I was involved with or something I was listening to, some kind of an encounter, a lecture or something like that, And some people are able to perceive and hear things that other people aren't. It all depends on your level of consciousness. So you'll often find situations where there are people who are simply incapable of hearing what you're saying. And by hearing, what I mean is they don't fully get it or understand it. Like they may hear the words, but they may not be able to understand the full meaning or share what you are sharing with them. It's a bit difficult to describe how this actually works if you've never actually had this experience, but I can assure you many people have had this experience, and you probably will yourself at some point. I, for example, recall once I was at a lecture being given by an Indian mystic who was visiting the city where I was living, and there was maybe a couple hundred people in attendance. And at one point, this is another one of those extremely vivid memories I have. I was in my early 20s. And at one point, I realized he was speaking specifically at me because he was addressing something that was going on in my life. And it was kind of a major turning point I was at. And he was speaking very clearly and directly at me. There was no question about it. It's like we were having almost a psychic conversation or telepathic conversation. And meanwhile, the rest of the audience is listening to what he's talking about, and it all makes perfect sense to them, but they do not get the full significance and meaning of what he was saying because the context was in me. It was so clear. And I even spoke to some people after about it and said, "Do you get that?" And they're kind of like, "Huh, I'm not sure I know what you're talking about." Oh, so you'll often find this in spiritual texts as well, that there can be multiple levels of meaning, and some of which can only be discerned from a higher level of awareness. The words are right there, they're on the page, but someone can read them and go right past them without even recognizing what was just said or written, and someone else will stop and go like, "Oh my God, that's completely mind-blowing." So there are different levels of consciousness is what I'm trying to say. And you'll note this it's quite a fascinating thing. There are some people literally you can't even talk to about these kinds of things. And then there are some people who have a very narrow slice of it, like maybe an ideological perspective on reality. And then there's other people who you can entirely resonate with, almost as if you're sharing an experience with them, and you're both perceiving it at a very high level at the same time. A phenomenal spiritual teacher of mine once said that the Christ could be standing next to most people and they wouldn't even know it. I'll repeat that. The Christ could be standing next to most people and they wouldn't even know it. I would hope that I would, if the Christ was standing next to me, that I would feel it and go like, holy crap. But there's a lot of people who just wouldn't even know. He could be riding on the bus with you one day, right next to you maybe even. So our level of consciousness is very important. There's nothing you can do about that. Your level of consciousness is what it is. It's the product of countless incarnations and spiritual journeys and explorations and trials and tribulations and grace and all kinds of other things. And it's up to you. It's a product of your being and of your effort over time. But it's important to realize that that's just the way it is. You know, it can be very helpful when you do encounter people that you can communicate with about these kinds of things, because you start to realize that you're not crazy and that your experiences are legitimate because they're shared. You know, if you speak to 3 or 4 or 5 people who say, "Oh, I had that same experience," well, then you can be pretty confident that you're not just making that up. It's not just happening in your mind. And that is why the social aspect of spirituality is so important, because we can start to relax and have some sense that there's nothing wrong with us, that we're not crazy, that this is normal, at least for some people, and that you're not alone. And of course, you can share and discuss your observations with people of like mind. I have had conversations where I was deeply in conversation with someone, and then a third party comes along and they're standing there looking at us, and we kind of stop and look at them, and they look at us and go like, "What the hell are you guys talking about?" And we just laugh because we've deeply gone down into a rabbit hole, and there's no way to pull someone down in there with us where we were without a lot of effort, because some of these conversations can go on for hours. Anyway, it's all fascinating and it's all fun, but I wanted to express that because I think it's very important that we realize that reality can't reflect back, and by reality I mean what we're experiencing here on Earth, is that it's very important to realize that reality will not necessarily reflect back to us our true state of being. And it may be a matter of connecting with people that resonate with us and who are similarly evolved in some way. Very important. And I have talked about multidimensional reality in past episodes a long time ago, but not this specific aspect of spirituality and socializing. So there you go. I hope that's helpful. It's helpful to me if you subscribe, like, and share this video if you find it useful. And if you're just getting going on your spiritual journey, if you're waking up, God bless you. It's like life really begins at that point, as far as I'm concerned. Take care, and I'll talk to you again soon.